Today's show is all about microgreens, and it's all about really one specific topic: sanitation and food safety. That's the central theme that runs throughout this episode. For the topic, I'm joined by microgreen grower Chris Thoreau, somebody who grew microgreens commercially in Vancouver for over 10 years. And one of the things that Chris put a lot of emphasis on when his business really started to grow was this subject: sanitation and food safety. So today we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what you should be thinking about when you're growing microgreens, regardless of what your regulations really are. You're growing a product that in the veg world is considered much higher risk than something like a lettuce. So these are things you need to pay attention to. So hopefully this episode will get you thinking about what you can do and what procedures you can put in place so your farm can produce safe, sanitary, and regulatory compliant food. Let's jump right into it. Food safety for microgreens with Chris Thoreau. Recently got a question that somebody emailed in, and this is somebody at the beginning of their journey with microgreens, and it was around the idea of microgreens being high risk in respect to human pathogens. Can you talk a little bit about your understanding of why they're treated that way and what it was like from your experience as a grower dealing with selling to stores, dealing with the regulators when it came to selling microgreens? Not sprouts. We'll stay away from that. We'll just go with microgreens.
Yeah, and as it's a topic that comes up a lot, and I want to stay away from sprouts, but where it comes in with microgreens is some health bodies, including many Canadian ones, classify microgreens as a sprout. And so from their perspective, the microgreen should be treated in the same way that a sprout is treated, which would include seed sanitation, a regular sanitation program for your equipment, things like that. So it is a region to region issue. So the approach I took in developing the microgreens business was, and I've brought this up before, I'm designing the business for success, which means as I grow as a business, these guidelines and regulations that exist at different levels become more and more important. And I often use the analogy of, if I want to sell jam at the farmer's market, I just need to have my food safe and a little sign up at the market that says, I make this jam at home, not in a commercial kitchen. And then as soon as I want to start selling provincially or into other provinces or into other countries, as it is with all products, your level of accountability goes up. Keeping in mind, the thing that everybody's doing when they grow microgreens is they're growing food to sell to the public. And the sanitation becomes an important issue, one in terms of just liability. We live in a libelous society and these things should be of concern. And the other thing is just in terms of product integrity. If somebody eats your product and gets sick, not only is there liability issues, but there's business issues. A recall or bad press could be devastating for a business. Those are a couple of perspectives on, in the beginning, why I basically tried to design a system that met Canadian guidelines for sprouting production with their microgreen operation, which is tedious at first, but at this point, it's just routine. It's just built into the system. So it really is about designing a system that's designed to succeed, which means to grow and sell to a wider audience. As you sell to different types of markets, they're going to have different requirements. And so we can sell to farmers market as is, pretty much no problem. Our requirement is bringing stuff in a cooler and keeping it cold. If we want to sell to a grocer, some grocers have very strict policies on what they will and will not buy. So Whole Foods here in Canada, when we looked into Whole Foods, I believe we needed to have a certified HACCP or hazard analysis and critical control point plan in order to sell to Whole Foods, whereas other grocers didn't need that. But often people do ask, what are your protocols and whatnot? And we break it down to three. One is we do follow the guidelines issued by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which are guidelines. They're not required. The second one is we have standard operating procedures for everything that we do in the workflow, which really are built on HACCP principles. So where are the points in the production process, right from getting the seed in to dropping off the product at the customer and really having the product on the shelf in a grocery store. And your critical control point there is making sure the package is closed, to doing regular testing of the product in a lab to look for any sort of fluctuations if we're seeing a spike in presence of any microbes or anything whatsoever. Do those things, and then when somebody does ask, we're prepared. And some grocers and markets are flexible, and others are quite strict.
With the regulations in Canada where you were operating, what would be the littlest you could get away with? Did you have to do any of this? Because this is one thing that I see come up all the time. Do I have to do anything with regards to food safety? It's one thing to say, I'm going to take a proactive approach and I am going to do something, but it's another thing to say, I don't have to, so I'm not gonna. Could you have not done anything and still been okay to sell?
So once again, in Canada, for sprouts, they are guidelines. They are not regulations, and so they're not required. They're very strongly suggested. And to play on that a little bit, because there's guidelines and because they exist, and because I know they exist, if I don't follow them and something happens, that's an issue. And even if you're not aware of them and something happens, you can't really plead ignorance. Ignorance is not generally a plead in Canada in legal matters. I don't know how it is in the US. But it is your responsibility to know what your responsibilities are when running a business. Now, beyond the sprouting guidelines, in Canada, we have the Food Safety Act. In general, like with anything, like the general principle is you must do due diligence. And I think we often do this stuff without even thinking about it. We wash our hands, we package things, we do a lot of these things. But once again, when you're selling a product to the public, you need to step that up a little bit. Whatever you're doing to sell, to eat at home or maybe trade with your friends, that's up for you all to decide, and you can take more risk or whatever. But because they're guidelines, I, in the beginning, didn't do everything I would have liked to do because it was too hard to do that. I was really careful about the things I did do. I did really good sanitation from the beginning, sanitizing the benches, sanitizing the trays. There are things that we didn't do regular testing of the product, like that was just too expensive and too much at the time. So it's one of those things that you build up over time and you try to work towards. And I think that's when we get inspected by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the thing they say is it's like level of impact. So even if we have to do a recall, you don't actually need to call your farmers market customers or even your restaurants. And you actually just need to get in touch with the grocers. And so there's even with that, it's inflexibility. Whereas if we were selling intraprovincially, for example, then there would be a different process. So even the health institutions, organizations, regulatory bodies, they recognize that as well. And so there is a bit of flexibility there, but it's good to have those things there in the middle or in the beginning. So I actually wrote guidelines in my first year of growing microgreens that I wasn't following because they were the guidelines I was aiming for. And so I always had those in my mind.
For somebody that's setting out to do this, whether, let's say not because they have to, but because they are following these strongly suggested guidelines, how critical do you think it is to document what you're doing? Not necessarily just up front with a standard operating procedure, but logging things like walk-in temperature, or today on March 31st, we sanitized the bench. Should you have records showing that you're actually doing what your procedures say you're doing?
If you don't have the records, then you're not doing it, even if you're doing it. So that's how it works from an inspection point of view. They're basically saying, well, it's great that you've got this book that has all these things in it, but you have no log to show you've done it. You have no signatures, you have no dates, you have nothing. So that's how it's through that documentation that you demonstrate your accountability. And the example I always give is, go into a public washroom and you look on the back of a door and there's a little chart there. And this says this bathroom was last checked by so-and-so at such and such time and such a date. And if something happens and somebody goes into that bathroom and slips on the floor and bangs their head, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to take that log. Now that log isn't everything, And there's actually been a recent interesting case in BC where there's service contractors that maintain roads here in the wintertime, as there is everywhere. And what's interesting is people were complaining about the roads, that the inspectors come in and they don't go and they don't check the roads. They check the logs. Nobody goes out and checks the roads and measures the amount of salt on the road. They check your records, first of all. And so at the same time, and I can't remember what happened, but I think the record was there, but this whole thing didn't actually get done. You can make all the logs you want. You could just have them autofill by some piece of software, I'm sure, and have an electronic log and never do anything. The logs are your commitment to demonstrating your following through with those procedures.
Say somebody has loose guidelines where they're not even strongly suggested in their jurisdiction. What are the things that you would do just from operating in this space for as long as you did to say, I wouldn't sell microgreens without doing these things, regardless of what was suggested in the regulations?
One of the problems with that is once you start doing something, not doing it isn't an option. There's been a few times where I've been in a rush or we've been out of sanitizer at the food peddlers and I grow a crop without them. And it just feels like getting into a car without a seatbelt. I don't know, I could think of a whole bunch of really bad analogies that I won't use now, but it just doesn't feel right. But there are a few things. And so the other piece about this is the sanitation actually helps you grow a better product. So for example, I could always tell when we weren't washing our trays as much or weren't cleaning the benches as much or weren't doing our sanitation routine as much because we'd get more disease in the crops. And I always had a sense it was coming. It's we're rushing, we're busy, we're not getting things done as quickly. And then inevitably we would see more disease. We'd have a fungal disease come in, some sort of virus, and you get rid of it by just sanitizing everything. And you bleach it all and you kill as much as you can and then you recontinue. And I'm really mindful that my paradigm is not start with a sterile environment and don't let anything live. Not by any means. We do really value a biologically active environment, but you need to keep things clean in order to keep that biology beneficial. So there's a balance there. We're not in there fumigating things and dumping chemicals on everything randomly. We do things in a way to make sure we've got a regular routine and things just stay generally fairly clean. So that's a big one, routine cleaning. And we do this in our homes. We do this in our workplace. So why we wouldn't do this with the microgreens production, I don't know. It should be just a natural thing to do. The other thing would be keeping your product cold. Your product is going to look better at the market if you can keep it in the cooler as long as possible. And it's going to have a much longer shelf life for your customer if you keep it cold. Every time it warms up and cools down, it warms up and cools down. Each one of those events significantly shortens the life of your product. And so if you're looking at the wide picture of what you're offering your customers, one of the things that we've always gotten good feedback on is there's no waste product in restaurants. The way we've got it set up is even if a restaurant misses a delivery and has a product for a week, instead of having 2 deliveries a week, that product looks almost as good on day 7 as it did on day 1. And you can't have a product maintain its integrity that long if you don't store it properly. So our goal is cut, package, and into the fridge as soon as possible, like just minutes. And that's key. That's not just human health. It's the longevity of your product. It's the impression of your product with your customers, and it's an extended shelf life. So the 2 basics are routine sanitation and cleaning and keeping things cold.
One thing we were talking about before we got recording was just the cost of doing this. And when I think about people doing something that I'll say is semi-optional, open for interpretation, they're either not doing it because it's too expensive or because it's too much work. When somebody has 200 flats a week that they're doing, what goes into that? Are you scrubbing every flat every week and it's just part of the job and the cost there is really just the labor? Because I'm thinking if you're using a solution to do this, like that's not expensive at all.
No, there's many components to where the cost comes from. There's your sanitizer cost, which is pennies per tray. And even at 200, even at 1,000 trays a week, it's not a lot. But there is time that goes into it. It does take time to wash trays. It takes time to do your your regular sanitation and cleaning shelves, things like that. So labor, as in most things, is a major expense there. As a portion of your hours, it's measurable. You could go, as a portion of how many hours go into this, 10 to 15% is really just cleaning. When I think of a harvest, we'll start at 8 a.m. and be done by noon. And then it's 3 hours of cleaning, a couple hours of delivery and things like that. So it is a significant labor cost. And so this is important. If we're looking at it from a business development point of view, it's a factor we need to put in there. And if you're building your business more on this idea that a tray is worth $20 or $25 and you need to just produce those trays as quickly as possible, then on paper, it looks like a really good business. But if you can't maintain that because your sanitation program is poor and someone gets sick, or you're just getting constant diseases in your crop, the idea of this $25 a tray sort of return it's an illusion. And so I think it's important to be realistic about the numbers. And I probably wasn't that realistic in the beginning. I had this idea as well. Wow, there's good money to be made here. But the hours that go into it are a lot. And it wasn't until really more formally doing a business plan and looking at what the cost into that $25 tray is where you start to realize, oh yeah, there's the labor for the producing the tray and then cleaning up afterwards. There's their seeds, your soil. Then there's the time at the market. There's your travel time. There's repairs. There's your insurance on top of that, your liability insurance, which people don't have. And these are just all the natural costs of doing business. And realistically, it's why businesses are hard to run and they're stressful and people go bankrupt. I think within that, going back to other previous things we've talked about, is you need to be very efficient about everything you do. You don't need to be taking your time sanitizing things isn't going to make it any better. You want to just have your protocol and follow it and set that protocol up to be as efficient as possible, because your efficiency actually does significantly reduce your labor cost by making sure stuff is done in a reasonable amount of time.
You mentioned something there in regards to liability insurance. Can you talk about how you approached insurance? I know you're in Canada. A lot of people listening to this are in the US, but this is a big topic. I think it's not discussed very much. I don't think we've ever talked about it on the show. I've talked about it a lot on the livestock side of things with some podcasts I do there. But when you were selling these microgreens to people, to stores, to restaurants, how did you approach insurance as a business owner?
So for many years, I didn't. Probably for the first maybe even 3 or 4 years as a sole proprietor, I had no business insurance. And it wasn't even that big a cost. I think $700 or $800 a year, but it was a 5-month-a-year operation. It was just me and one other person. And it was just so small scale that it's not something I really wanted to do. I was still a bit like the regulations in a way, because I can only jump through so many hoops despite all the things I've just told you. At heart, there are all these guidelines and regulations, they drive me nuts. But it goes back to building a business for success and growing up. And what made me have to go through the insurance process was turning the business into a cooperative. So that was one thing. Now we're an organization. And so as member owners, we're also board members, and we have legal accountabilities as a board member to look out for the interest of the co-op. So that was one thing. And then the other thing is once again, was scale. When we were doing things 5 months a year, really the number of people that eat our product is pretty low. I saw every single individual sprout that left that site. I saw. And as we got bigger, there were days I wasn't there. I didn't do everything. We had hired people. I had partners. We had protocol. I can only hope people were following them. So there's more factors there. And we scaled up. We were selling to multiple restaurants, grocers. Our grocer business really expanded, selling to other delivery programs. And so just the level of accountability went up. And so that was just something that had to happen. And in terms of the insurance, basically, I'm not an expert on insurance, but insurance people are. So we sat down with our local insurer and said, here's what we do. We need to be covered. what does this cover for? What doesn't it? And basically walk through that with them, and they put together a package that works for us. One of the things to consider is your level of liability. Are you insured for $1 million or up to $10 million? That's going to affect your costs. And so those are questions you have to think about as well. What is the risk of, once again, the risk of having a $10 million claim? And yeah, do you have enough confidence in your system to know you're doing your due diligence, that the likelihood is pretty low as well? So finding something reasonable, like you would with your, say, your car insurance, for example.
I'm assuming if in Canada, it's like it is here in the US, to get a lot of protection insurance-wise, it's actually relatively cheap in terms of an annual premium.
Yeah, and it depends. Your premium's based on, like here, ours is based on our sales. And so as a relatively small business, that's not a lot. And then your level of coverage, and then what you've got covered. We've got liability insurance, which kind of protects our business against, people getting sick, things like that. Somebody gets hurt while they're visiting the site, things like that. And then we've also got like our container greenhouses insured. We have insurance on our seed stock. We carried $10,000 in insurance for seed because we've got this seed just sitting there. We carry insurance for our germinating and growing crop, which is several $1,000s, things like that. It insures us at the farmer's market. So we're covered in a lot of ways. Could maybe be more or less covered. I seem to recall going through a pretty robust process with the insurer just to make sure we're covered. We've got insurance, we're doing our due diligence, and if something happens, it's going to be shitty, but that's what insurance is for.
Tying into all this, one area that I see as a vector for potential disease to come into the crop, bad, but not as bad as somebody getting sick, as the product just doesn't last as long, is sending product out that's wet when it goes to the customer. And we got this question recently, and it involves spinning microgreens. And there's a lot of different ways out there to do this now. Would you approach spinning microgreens, which I see as dainty, although pea shoots and sunflower shoots maybe not so dainty, with one of the washing machine type conversions? Or how would you approach drying some of these microgreens that you do have to wash?
Yeah, so we've gone through many iterations of this. I'm recalling right now both radish and buckwheat in a spinner. And there's two things that happens with both of those crops. They get damaged and they don't actually get dry. We have different protocols for different crops to make sure that when they go into the package, they're dry. And for most crops at this point, we keep them dry. Something like radish, we've got 4 days where it's in the light. Maybe the first day they'll get overhead watered, maybe the second day, but after that, there's no water on the leaf ever again. And so there's 2 days of dryness. So when we go to cut that radish, it's actually dry. To make doubly sure that's the case, we have fans over our radish crop all the time. Having that radish dry when it gets cut is the only way to make it a feasible product. Other crops like pea, if you've grown pea shoots, like peas just shed water. You could water pea right up to the last day, and the next day they'll be perfectly dry. They're cut and they go right into the bag as well. So the other issue is all that ties into is a question that might come up is, do you wash your crops before packaging them? When you can wash your crops in water, you can wash your crops in a bleach or a hydrogen peroxide or a peracetic solution before packaging them to make a ready-to-eat product. There's a lot of different things you can do. And this was one of the things that had us washing products in the beginning, so we could say we did wash it. But the reality is when we're doing our overhead watering, we are washing that product. We're washing it in situ while it's still growing. And so we do want to do the overhead watering to clean it off, but then we want to give it some time to sit, and so there's no more water on it. And we also have very good practices in the greenhouse to make sure there's no contamination afterwards. So we're very careful about what's above the crop and how we handle it in order to keep it clean. So basically, most stuff we pack dry, and it does fine as long as, once again, it's being cut and packaged and put into the fridge right away. But that's crucial. The one crop that we don't do that with is sunflower. And there's two main reasons for that. One is to get those holes removed. It's really easy to do in water. It's the easiest method, and we could do that very quickly. The other thing is every alternative method I've tried for packaging sunflower without washing them within 2 to 3 days, we start to see oxidation on the cut point. And it really is only when they get a couple minutes in cold water and then get dried that they don't get that. And that really contributes to the longevity. It's a huge factor with sunflowers in extending their shelf life. Basically, and it's not until day 7 that you start to see any sort of changing in color, changing in quality at that cut point. And so that's a product that it's worth going through that with. And because it's a more hardy microgreen, it actually stands up fairly well in the spinner. But just the process of putting them into the spinner and taking them out of the spinner is damaging as well. Basically, every time you handle a product, it risks damage. So it is a bit unfortunate there, but generally we try to do that mindfully. You don't throw them in and just grab a handful and rip them out. You handle them gently, and you can generally keep your damage down to a minimum. In terms of keeping things dry as well and keeping the quality up, in an ideal system, I would probably grow on a similar cycle, but instead of getting everything ready to harvest, say on like the Friday morning when we're harvesting, I would take everything on the Thursday evening when it's dry and I would put it into a walk-in cooler. And so we're actually cooling the crop significantly overnight. And then when we cut it, it's already cut at a very cold temperature and packaged and put into the fridge right away. Whereas what we do now, this time of year is fine. When we take stuff out of the greenhouse, it comes outside, and in our prep area, it's quite cold. And so the crop does cool down. But in the summer, when we do that and we bring it over, it maintains that. And this is the same concept as field heat. It maintains its field heat. And so I think we could actually extend the life of the product even more. And we're getting probably a minimum of 8 days on radish, which is our least keeping crop. But as you get into the daintier ones like arugula and cilantro and whatnot, those are crops that I think would really benefit from having, even if it's just a couple hours in the cooler, to bring that crop down and then cut it cold, package it, and put it into the fridge would really extend its life. So that again, it's product quality, but it's this concept of keeping things at a low temperature is also a way to reduce microbial growth. Like stuff doesn't grow at 3 to 5 degrees Celsius or whatever that is in Fahrenheit. And so even if there is something present, the risk of it getting somebody sick is really small. So these are the factors of like, even if everything isn't up to speed, just keeping things cold, which is a really easy thing to do, and maintaining the cold chain is a really easy thing to do, that reduces your risk probably more than as much as every other factor combined.
If we're thinking about a crop health standpoint and a consumer health standpoint from somebody eating the microgreens, let's think about soil here. You guys eventually moved on to getting your soil made for you, delivered in totes. But for people starting out, there's a lot of options out there. Going the tote route might be hard to justify. And the other option then is going a bagged potting soil route, which I know a lot of people do, but sometimes in those bags, like I've opened bags and they're moldy when you open them. How would you advise somebody to approach soil from a pathogen standpoint if they're still on the smaller scale and just starting out?
Yeah, that's a good question and a good example, which I haven't experienced. And so hearing that's something that you've experienced makes me go, what would I do in that situation? So the number one thing I would do is you've got to learn who the good soil providers are. I've gotten soil from different companies over the years, but the soil we get now, we've got a company that mixes it for us, arranges the delivery. If we want them to test a component of it to see if there was pathogens present, they'll do that. They're a reputable company. And so I would do the same thing about looking for a soil mix, so something that's prepackaged. So I'd be looking at like a sunshine potting mix or something like that meets my needs, but is coming from a fairly reputable, well-known, respected company, as opposed to, oh, look, this mushroom manure potting mix is on sale from Bob's Garden Center. Maybe different size companies they have different protocols for how clean their product needs to be. And a big company is going to have more strict protocols. So just like they would with microgreens. So you need to know who those companies are and do your best to source their stuff. But it's good. You want to test different products out, just like you would test different seeds and find out what's going to work for your system. If you want to be even more sure, you can get in touch with the company and say, can you tell me a little bit about your processing, how you do this, how you do that? And a lot of companies are pretty happy to share that or actually have that information on their website. So it's a little bit of homework. It's a little bit of trial and error. Obviously, talking to other growers is another great way to get a sense of what's working and what's not. But as I've said about seed, as I've said about other things, when you find something you like stick with it. Don't make change unless there's a reason to make change. And if you do open that bale of sunshine mix one day and you do see mold in there, you call the company right away and you say, I've been using your mix for a long time. I opened this bale. This is the problem I saw. You're going to get your money back. They're probably going to send you a credit. In the end, you're probably going to benefit, and you take that bale back and you get another one. It's shitty that it's more time and it's more energy and more effort, but that's just another one of those sort of costs you incur as a business owner that you don't want to. But the reality is 10 to 15% of your time is just basically wasted doing stuff, not even related to directly to production in your business.
You're somebody who's tried a bunch of stuff over the years. For somebody who can just buy a sunshine mix off the shelf, would you just go with one of the ones that people use for vegetable starts, or would you buy a whole bunch of different soils and test them out and see what works best?
I personally would go for a pre-mix, something that has like a potting mix that has a peat or a quar or a mix of those, a perlite component, and then ideally a mineral component, like some lime added, maybe like rock phosphate, green sand, just a bit of stuff in there, or a compost mix. And I think there is some stuff out there like that. Or I would buy a basic potting mix, which is more a peat perlite mix, and then add my own compost, especially if I had a compost product that I really liked, that I knew, which we have here. There's a local compost I really like that I would probably want to put into my product. And that way you're also the one determining the level of that. You could do your own mix overall. In the first year, I used to bring in like a yard of soil at a time, I just did soil, or what did I do? I did compost and vermiculite was the first mix I used. And actually it was a very expensive mix, but things grew very well. But the mixing soil takes time. And I think I was inconsistent, and I had to always make sure I had the right stuff. And it was hard. And then when things come pre-mixed, that's a big time saver. And it often cost-wise ends up being about the same because it's saving you time, it's saving you money. But it's worth experimenting a little bit, because just so you can do some comparisons and see, can you get a 15 or 20% more yield by a different soil mix? Or can you buy a premix and just modify it a little bit by adding a little bit of compost, or adding some lime, or adding like a kelp meal or something? Or, as we were talking about earlier, like your own sort of biological solution, like a compost tea or an actively aerated compost tea, or some kelp or liquid fertilizer, or an enzyme mix. Like those are things you can add in a liquid form or a powder form afterwards as well. So there's a lot of approaches, but in terms of ease, by going and picking up a bale of something and taking it home is very easy. In the beginning, you want to make things as easy as possible because you're going to have enough challenges as it is.
One thing I've seen a lot of people do lately, a lot of the people who I've interviewed recently are doing this, is they are bottom watering everything. You didn't bottom water. If you think about bottom watering, if you were going to do that, how would you approach that? And why wouldn't you bottom water, and why would you top water?
So we do mostly overwatering with the food peddlers and a little bit of underwatering, as we just talked about. Mostly the underwatering is good because it keeps the tops dry. And some of the things, like when you get into things like cilantro and arugula, they're really dainty. So watering above them actually just knocks them over. It brings them in contact with the soil, which means there might be more to wash off. And so we do a combination of overhead and underwatering. The overhead watering, as I said before, it does rinse the crop. It's taking everything and moving it downward into the soil, so you are cleaning things as you go. There's a lot of systems out there for underwatering, and there's a lot of hydroponic-like systems, and there's a lot of systems for the cannabis growing industry, actually. And we did look at them. The challenge we had in using one of those systems is they were standardized for a different system. So you could buy these 8x4, basically a plywood-sized sheet of these big watering trays, And you would actually just grow your microgreens in those trays or flood trays, and the water would go in at scheduled times and then drain out, however it's done. And really, you would never actually have to do anything. It would all happen automatically. If you recall, what I've talked about in the past is watering your crop is actually a very good time to spend with your crop because you're getting to look at it. You get to look at every tray. You get to make sure each tray has a bit less or a bit more water if it needs it. And if you do see a problem, you're catching that problem right then. You're not seeing like the day before harvest. It's like, oh, we've actually got some problems here, which if you would have been watering 2 days ago, you might have caught those problems and been able to make the adjustments you needed to avoid them. But so what we couldn't find was a tray system that fit in our 5-foot long shelves. Like they just don't make 5-foot long watering trays, flood trays for our system. And we looked at doing something customized, getting something fabricated from a plastics place. And it was just way too expensive because it's way too custom. And so what we ended up doing, which takes a bit more time, is getting like actually boot trays, like a tray you'd put at your front door to put your boots on to trap water. And I found these really good ones for about $5 each at Home Depot quite a few years ago. And they're the perfect depth and they're the perfect size that if I put a tray in it and fill the water to the top of the watering tray, that microgreen tray basically soaks up all the water. It works out perfectly. And so it's a little bit of putting a tray in and then taking it out and then filling it up and putting the next tray in. But it's the same thing. Once you get into a routine, you can do that fairly quickly. And so it was a way to being able to underwater some crops at a certain time without having these bigger trays within the whole system. If we had a different layout and more space, I might buy a big 4 by 8 foot watering tray, and then I could put all those trays in at once and do that, and then just take them all out and put the next batch in. Our layout doesn't allow for that. And so once again, we came up with a solution that works for our system. And even though it wasn't ideal, when we implemented it, we tried to make sure that we developed a system to allow us to do that very efficiently and also very hygienically, again. So all those trays, after we do our underwatering, they go into our wash system, they get washed and they get sanitized. So all those things, again, they add another layer of detail to the operation. So that efficiency comes in very important again.
Let's say you had a lot more space and you could get a bigger setup in there. Would you do an automated bottom water system and not overwater on the crops that you overwatered? Or do you think there is a distinct advantage to overwatering certain things?
Some stuff I would continue to overwater. I would overwater sunflower for sure. I think the cooling down of the crop that you get in the summer actually improves the crop. It does wash the crop. I would do the same thing for peas, and I would do it for every crop in the early stages, because if you don't ever top water, you'll see a lot of debris, little bits of perlite and little flakes of soil on there. In the first couple of days, as I mentioned before, we overwater everything. We're just giving the crop a good cleaning. It's not a huge amount of watering. We're not dousing the trays, but it really gives them a good rinse. But if I had more space, it would be better that everything was the shelving unit that grows the sprouts is also the watering unit, which means once you're done with the overhead watering, it automatically switches over to underwatering. It all happens automatically. So the trays fill up, they drain automatically. Yeah, I would definitely go that route. The thing it adds is after each harvest, you then need to take those trays, those flood trays, and you need to wash and sanitize them. And that was a factor for us. If we were to look at all the different 5-foot sections we have and all the different watering trays we would have to put in there, that would actually add a huge amount of labor time in terms of being able to sanitize that material. Because I'm so bloody neurotic about that was a factor. Whereas now, once that crop is off the shelf, we wipe down the shelf, we spray it. We don't have to move anything. That is a factor. And there is a way to do that in situ, right? If you've got a really good drainage system, you could open the drain right up, spray everything down, rinse it really good, give it a light spraying with whatever your sanitizer is, either let that dry and evaporate or rinse that off again. Then you might be able to just do that in situ.
Interesting thing to think about. A lot of options out there for people that have space. And with the cannabis industry, I think pushing a lot of these limits and bringing new tech out there, there's more and more of this type of stuff coming out there. One last thing I want to close this episode out with is some of the crops that you can grow in these systems. The topic of very high priced seed has came up in quite a few emails I've gotten recently when you start looking at very niche products. When you look at products that might have an expensive seed, but have a high dollar value per ounce in some cases, how do you approach seed cost versus what you can sell the product for if you were going to grow something? Is there a profit percentage you're looking at per tray? Because I'm assuming most of the tray cost is in the seed itself.
Most of the tray cost is in the labor, actually. Your labor cost, you think you're filling that tray with soil, you're seeding the tray, you're watering the tray over time, you're harvesting that tray, you're washing that tray. There's a lot of labor that goes into that is your biggest cost. I'm recalling for sunflower, the cost of a tray with soil and seed is about $1.88. And for radish, so when I think about a high value crop, we do like a radish mix. And one of those seeds is a red daikon radish, which is about 4 times the size of the price of the regular radish. And so even that cost comes to about $275, $280 maybe per tray with seed. And once again, so that's not a big percentage of the cost of the tray. More it's going to be the labor, like does a tray take 10 seconds to cut like it does with sunflower, or does it take 2 minutes like it does with arugula? So there's your labor cost is actually a bigger factor than your seed. And what we look at in terms of pricing the tray is we price it on the return for the tray generally. So each tray we're trying to get anywhere from $15 to $30, depending on the market. And so you price it based on what you need, based on the yield. So that's going to give you a different per unit weight price for every product. If you had a seed that was particularly expensive, that was bringing your tray cost up from $2 to $6, that's a different story. And you would definitely want to adjust your price to account for that. And you would basically be saying to your chef or your grocer customers, you're paying for rarity. You're paying for something that nobody else can do. And so if you want me to grow that for you, I will, but here's the price you're going to pay. And they're either going to say, great, we've got the money, or no, okay, I get it. That's ridiculous. Yeah, that's the factor is just basically your labor and seed costs both need to be considered. Labor is usually a bigger consideration. I do see there's a few microgreens forums I follow, one on Facebook, and I see people asking questions. I think people want to have the next crop. What can I grow that nobody else is growing? What can I grow that nobody's thought of? And these are good. I think we should always be thinking these things, but growing stuff because it's new and different isn't a reason to grow it. You have to have a market for it. And we get requests every once in a while for something really strange and obscure or something really hard to grow. And we're like, we would, but if we're going to grow this for you, we need to know we have a market elsewhere. And if we can't find a market elsewhere, your price per unit is going to be very high. So it's why we end up with these sort of standard products of pea, sunflower, radish, buckwheat, wheatgrass. Over time, you can create a new market. Sometimes if you grow it, they will come. So you just need to choose. And I see a lot of people trying to grow. 2 crops that come to mind are shiso and flax. I've seen people asking about them lots over the years. And I'm thinking about the costs and the rarity of those, the quality of your end product, how many people would buy it. And then, and comparing that to other things. So you have to really think about why you're doing that and whether there is going to be a market for it in the end.